Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Bold TV. I'm Carrie Sheffield here with Clay Aiken.
Morning.
We have a great show. Make sure to put your comments and questions because we got Congresswoman Claudia Tenney. She's joining us. She had a 5:30 a.m. vote this morning that just passed a government spending bill to keep the government funded through March 23rd. Very contentious bill. We're going to talk with her about it. Trump just signed it into law. And so put your comments there for the Congresswoman. So Clay,
very short government shutdown again, though.
It was very.
5 hours,
it was
like
just
3
a
or
little
4
tweak.
hours.
Yeah, just a little blip. But a lot going on. And wow, just.
The Olympics start today.
The Olympics start today. We got a couple pictures to show you. South Korea president, the South Korean president is shaking hands with Kim Jong-un's sister. Let's put that picture up real fast. We got that picture? This was historic because this was North Korea's dictator, his sister, his little sister, who's basically helping with the propaganda for the North Koreans. She came to the Olympics and was shaking his hand.
It's very big. I mean, the Olympics are supposed to be about bringing the world together. They always have been. This is probably one of the bigger events of Olympics still, even so, to bring the Koreans together. They're marching together. Under one banner. I believe they've combined some of their teams together for some things. So certainly arguments as to why that's been, what the catalyst for that was. Disagreements there, but it's happening nonetheless. And let's hope that it's the start of something beautiful instead of just a tease.
Well, speaking of tease, let's see these pictures too. That was a perfect segue, Clay, as usual. The impersonators. Let's get that picture up. So we had some Trump and Kim Jong-un impersonators. Oh, that is not a very big picture, but
although
yeah,
it's
anyway,
a pretty good impersonator of Kim Jong-un.
No, I think that well, it's kind of just.
Why would you want to do? I don't know why you'd want to do that. I feel like that would be very dangerous to show up looking like Kim Jong-un. Someone could just mistake you for him, and you could be in grave danger. I don't know that I would do that.
Who have you impersonated before?
I don't even dress up for Halloween. I dress up as Clay Aiken for Halloween.
Have you ever had anyone? Do you have lots of people dress up for you?
I hope not. Those poor things. Those poor things. There are a few people who tried years ago, but I discouraged it. I was like, that's not going to work. It's not a good thing for you. You don't want to impersonate me. Anyway.
Well, no one can impersonate your voice. Although, I want to put this tweet up and see if maybe you'll sing for us, Clay.
Not a chance, but what?
Put this tweet up about the fired five. So you guys might have seen this week with the final firing of the five in this picture. So let's get this picture up. It's another tweet.
We're slow on the uptake today.
Yeah, I don't know where the tweet is. Let's get our picture up. Come on,
So what happened?
So basically, there's this picture of 5 people who have now all been fired in the Trump administration. Omarosa, the Mooch.
Of course.
Can we please get that picture up? I don't know where the picture is, but
you're making it more awkward by continuing to ask for it. Just tell me the story.
All right. So there are 5 people who had their picture taken together. So it was Omarosa, the Mooch, well, this week the Porter guy, and then
Mike Flynn got fired too. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think he was in the picture. Oh, geez. At this point, let's just move on. But I want to talk about the Porter thing because
Such great broadcasting here.
Yeah, no, I don't. Yeah.
So, so what was? Just tell me the story, girl.
Okay. So basically, there was what?
Tell me the story. Stop worrying about the technical shit.
Of Porter, of Rob Porter. Yeah. Well, first of all, this is a very. I have a personal. I know his father. His father was my professor at Harvard, and I have to say that it's really unfortunate. But I know that he was putting a lot of pressure on his kids to succeed. So his father himself was a Rhodes Scholar, worked with multiple presidents. So I think what his son did was truly evil, from what we can tell. But just understanding this whole situation, like. I don't believe anybody is irredeemable. I think that he can rehabilitate himself, but at the same time, he needs to understand the full weight of the evil things that he did. So I'm glad he's gone. I'm glad he's out.
What does it say, though, that so many people continue to be fired from the administration? I mean, it says something. Omarosa is on Celebrity Big Brother right now, right?
Yep.
Talking smack. Not the smartest thing in the world to do. But, I mean, is there not something that should concern us about the fact that this administration is so young and has had so many people who were hired and shouldn't have been?
Well, I think it shows that this was a president who was brought into office because people wanted someone who was an outsider. And obviously, the people he brought in were outsiders. What was ironic about the Porter firing today was that basically this guy had been the ultimate insider. So he had worked for Mike Lee. He had worked, on various congressional committees. This was a guy who very much knew the ins and outs of Washington, which is why John Kelly liked him so much, because he was the ultimate smooth insider. So that's what I think is interesting about this moment, the fact that you have the insider who was put on the outs too.
Well,
but
plenty of people who.
Well, let's talk real quick about the memo, because it apparently the second
What memo could you possibly be talking about?
Well, so I had a conversation on MSNBC this week. Do we have that clip?
Oh my God!
I don't know if we do.
Who cares?
Do we have the clip? We try to bring multimedia to the show, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't.
But you were on with Jonathan Alter, right?
I was. Jonathan Alter, who's with the Daily Beast, and he and I were having a conversation about the memo. Do we have that clip?
It's an incredibly chilling effect to get a warrant on an American citizen based on partisan research that is unverified. The dossier's claims have been largely discredited. This sort of weaponization of the FBI is exactly what the Trump administration has the right to.
We've learned in the last 24 hours, if we didn't know it before, that the dossier was not the reason why the surveillance on Carter Page was continued, which is what is at issue in this nothing burger memo.
It was the reason
it is not the reason.
The FISA warrant was
it even says that
initially.
in the memo itself.
So this memo, why do we care? Seriously. I mean, you looked good, by the way, in that clip. But why do we really care about
that? Was Marsha from Bold Life who did my makeup.
Why is it such a big deal? I mean, I think it was so hyped up, incredibly hyped up. It turned out to be pretty universally considered. I hate to use the word nothing burger, but that's all that's coming to my head. Why to you is it a big deal?
Okay, first of all, if it was a nothing burger, why would people be fighting its release for so long?
Because let's not forget that Republicans fought its release, and a lot of the reason that Republicans like John McCain and several others fought its release was not because of the content of it, but because of national security issues. So a lot of the fighting of its release was the national security stuff. You know what I think you need today? And I don't advocate this very much usually because I'm not a big. But you need to just
mansplain to me?
No, you need to just get high. You need something to relax you a little bit. And I don't smoke pot or do any of that at all. But I needed a segue to get to our first segment, which is all about pot, right, Carrie? Which you need like a pot brownie or something right now to ease you.
I don't think you want my pupils to be even more dilated than they are.
So pot's a big issue right now. Well, it has been for a while, but it's beginning to be on the forefront more and more because of all these states that are starting to legalize it. Continually, more states are piling on. Change.org, our segment with Change.org, the largest petition platform in the world for civic organizing, and they empower individuals everywhere to create the world they want to see, the change that they want to see in the world. And they're several petitions on right now that are talking about this marijuana debate. So we're going to be joined right now by Nick Gillespie and America's first Juan Pablo Andrade. So Nick and Juan, thank you very much for joining us.
That's right. Thank you.
It's a hot button issue for folks, and it splits not just the Democrats and Republicans, but even within the conservative side of the country. It's split
and that's
people.
why we chose this panel today, is because we got a libertarian from Reason Magazine, the standard bearer for decades now for the libertarian movement.
Responsible drug use, yes. We believe in free minds, free markets, and not free weed, but market-priced weed.
And Juan Pablo, who is... That's great. Someone should hire you from the marijuana industry.
It's not just a drug thing, but we want it to be cheap too. Apparently.
Well, like in all things, you'll find cheap. You'll find the McDonald's of weed, the Starbucks of weed, as well as the
Neiman Marcus.
Neiman Marcus.
Yes, that's right. The Neiman Marcus.
Bergdorf Goodman.
Yeah.
Well, then we've got Juan Pablo, who is working with President Trump's committee, and by the way, I should say, was just named to Newsmax 30 under 30 Republican up-and-comers. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And you are very much opposed to legalizing weed.
Absolutely.
And so this is why I just think this panel here is like Clay said, just understanding the schism between what's happening on the right. So first, I think Juan Pablo, since we've had so many laws that have come out in support of it. And actually, let's throw up a couple petitions since this conversation is with our partner, change.org. So this is the overall kind of sense, don't escalate the failed war on drugs. This petition was started by Weldon Angelos. And Weldon was in prison. He's got an interesting story. It was a mandatory minimum sentence, and he was sentenced, I believe it was to 55 years. And he'd had 0 criminal charges before that, no criminal record. But because of the size of the amount of marijuana he was sentenced to this mandatory minimum sentence. And so you're seeing a lot of people pushing back on that. So Juan Pablo, tell us, why should that petition, what's wrong with that petition?
Well, don't get me wrong, that I believe that there should be, there needs to be a change in criminal justice reform. And, that's an absurd amount of time for someone to go to jail for just marijuana, and especially that they had, 0 record at all. But I do stand with what I believe, that I think that marijuana should be illegal. But like I said before, that's an absurd amount of time to serve in prison.
What's the argument, though? Just let's break it down to its base here. What's the argument behind why marijuana should be illegal, yet other drugs like alcohol or tobacco shouldn't be?
Well, my main, the thing that I stand by is that marijuana is a gateway drug. I've seen the effects of marijuana firsthand from many friends of mine using marijuana for years, not being able to get the effect, the same high after years of using it, and trying to go to other drugs, many other drugs, whether it's cocaine, crack, and then ultimately heroin, to try and get that same, the high.
Could someone make the argument that alcohol is the same thing? I know, I hear it. Could someone make the argument that alcohol does the same thing, though?
Well, absolutely, they can. But I think, drugs is a completely different story. And so the severity of each drug is a different story.
What defines a drug, Nick?
Yeah, well, this is, the ultimate gateway drug then is mother's milk. Because, the gateway theory, the idea that if pot itself isn't that bad, definitely, if you want to go to, say, a Philadelphia Eagles football game, you would rather have everybody in the audience, in the crowd, smoking pot rather than drinking beer, which is what they do, and they're violent. Pot is not a bad drug by itself, and I think you're conceding that, but it's a gateway theory. Very few people in the drug community talk about the gateway theory anymore, because the vast majority of people who smoke pot don't go on to do cocaine or heroin or anything like that. It's not a gateway drug, or the gateway theory doesn't make sense. My case for legalizing pot there are 2 basic arguments. One is a moral one. We're an adult society, and if people want to use a drug, an intoxicant, they should have that choice, as long as they're not harming other people by going out and driving, big rigs or subway cars or something like that. And pot has better effects or different effects for a lot of people. The other one is looking at the kind of cost benefit of prohibition. We know what went wrong with alcohol prohibition. It did diminish the use of alcohol, but at tremendous costs that were far worse than whatever benefits might have come from that. We've seen that with the war on drugs, and we've certainly seen that with the war on pot, which is the only illegal drug that a lot of people use. Very few people use heroin and cocaine. And we have seen now, this is why Gallup has 61% of Americans, a record number, believe in treating pot like wine, beer, and alcohol. Even a majority of Republicans think 50% think pot should be legalized. The real split here is not right, left, or Democrat, Republican, anything. It's age. And basically everybody over about 50, they're nervous about pot. The younger generation, who uses pot less than baby boomers did, they're okay with it. And
Juan Pablo's under 30.
Convince that older generation that, so let me ask the question. Convince that older generation that this is a legal argument that should be made, more so than this is a bunch of young kids who just want to get high. Well, that's really, I think, what people think.
If you want to ban pot, or the cost of banning pot does not reduce the use of pot, and it does not make anything better. But what it does do is it takes time out of education, because you're wasting time where a kid could be learning math or English, to tell them about drug awareness programs that even the government grants doesn't work. You screw up all sorts of policing, law enforcement, you bring in corruption, you screw up American foreign policy. A lot of our foreign policy is dictated by war on drug policies that end up destroying parts of Latin America and places like Central Asia, like Afghanistan. There is not a single thing that it is made better by prohibition. And first and foremost, people who have substance abuse problems with illegal drugs, they not just have to admit that they're addicts or that they have a problem, but that they're also criminals. There's nothing that you can say the war on drugs makes better.
Okay.
Pablo,
yeah. Well, I want to bring in an element here and get Juan Pablo's response, because at least as far as the middle ground goes, so it's another petition on medical use of marijuana. So we got a Change.org petition looking at pass the Careers Act and protect medical marijuana patients. Juan Pablo, do you think there's a difference between this in a medical case versus street drugs and recreational use?
Well, absolutely. I think if someone's prescribed marijuana for medical use, whether it's cancer or any other, terminal illness, and their doctors recommend that they use marijuana to, whether it's, as a full treatment to heal the pain or to help as in any way for the illness, I think that would it's necessary.
Doesn't that just kind of kill your argument? Because at the end of the day, what's happened in places like California where they do legalize medical marijuana, I can go get a license for that or a prescription for that in a heartbeat. It's very easy.
Well,
so
I think it needs to be harder for someone to just go into a store, go into any doctor's office, and just receive any pass to get a medical marijuana.
Well, let me ask this.
Can I throw in here of particularly if you're a conservative and you believe in limited government and privacy from the government, you're already then saying that now the government will have an ability to get between a doctor and a patient and say, well, that's not a real cause, et cetera. If you believe in limited government, and libertarians, there's liberals and conservatives and libertarians in the middle saying we want government and we want it to be limited. But it's like I don't want the government being able to dictate to my doctor what my course of action is. If I have AIDS wasting syndrome, if I have glaucoma pain, if I have anxiety, and the doctor says, you know what, medical marijuana is good for you. Let's be adults here, hold people responsible for their actions, whether they're medical professionals or recreational users, but give them the ability and the autonomy to say, this is my choice and I take on the benefits and the responsibility.
Okay, well then choose your argument then, because it sounds like you're making a case for medical marijuana. Would you be okay with that as a compromise?
Not as a compromise, because I do think it's a medicine, and I think one of the things that happened, we use so many more medicines than we did 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, and it did make people more comfortable, older people in society more comfortable with the idea of pot, because they realize when it's used as a medicine, it can be used responsibly, just like alcohol can either be used responsibly or irresponsibly to help dull the pain or to change your mood. I think we're more comfortable as a society because.
So it's an over-the-counter medication essentially, because you don't want to. You want to regulate it. Would regulating it make I can't say your side, but would regulating it strongly, making it legal but having regulations on it, like we do on tobacco and alcohol, would that be a position that's amenable to those who share the same belief you do?
I think regulating it, but in the medical use, would make sense. I don't think the government getting involved 100% is the right way, but the doctor's office using it safely and not necessarily, jumping to gun and jumping that medical marijuana is what you need for everything. Prescribing it safely. Like I said, no one could just go into any medical office and saying, yes, I have this, this, and this. I want a medical marijuana card, and just easily having it easily available to them.
Where are you, Carrie?
We were going to wrap.
Well, you know what? We might not end at 11. We're just going to. I like this conversation.
That a discussion about pot takes a long time.
I know.
But
well,
where do you stand?
Well, there's one more petition that I think might kind of explain where I'm coming from, and it's let's put that one up real fast, and then we got to wrap. But it's can we put that one up? So it's a petition talking about removing. It's called Pass the Marijuana Justice Act, removing the pot from the Controlled Substance Act. Sponsored by Cory Booker and Barbara Lee. And this petition was signed by the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, who's been on our show before. But I think that there's got to be a way. I do agree that it was interesting, actually. I was at Renaissance Weekend, which tends to be a left-leaning organization over New Year's, and there was a law enforcement officer there who was conservative and was talking to a lot of these liberals and saying, look, it's useful for me to be able to have these pot enforcement laws, because sometimes it can lead to understanding further criminality and having further ability to, because if there's smoke, there's fire. And I don't mean that, I just realized that's a really bad pun. But to be able to tie the law enforcement's hands in that way, I don't think it's good. But there's got to be a way, I think, to loosen the mandatory minimum sentences and not have it be so mindless. I think there's got to be a way to have it be both not tying the hands of law enforcement so that they can say, okay, this is sort of, it is a gateway drug in the respect of a lot of these drug dealers are doing harder things in terms of selling them and the criminality they're doing.
If I can just say, though, very quickly, I mean, when you create a black market, and it doesn't matter if it's in alcohol, if it's in pot, if it's in butter and meat during World War II, you create violence, you create problems for law enforcement, you also create opportunities for graft and corruption. When pot is treated, and we've seen this in places like Colorado, Oregon, California, Washington, D.C., where it's been decriminalized, not fully legalized, the violence goes away and the criminality goes away because it's not inherent in weed or in any drug. It's in the legal framework. And that's what needs to change. And I push back hard on the idea that we need to give cops more reason so that they can stop somebody and arrest them or shake them down or search them. We need to limit law. We need to limit the police just like we limit government and the economy.
Well, there's another conversation to have, another topic. This one is very fascinating to me because I think that there's a lot of legal questions. I hear echoes of the reproductive rights arguments coming in too. So we'll have to have you both back, Juan Pablo Andrade and Nick Gillespie. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to move on real quickly because we have a Congressman Claudia Tenney on Skype joining us. Thank you so much, Congressman Tenney, for being with us. We're sorry we're pushing a little bit later today.
Good morning. Sorry.
You there? Hi, Congresswoman.
You had a very busy morning. I'm impressed with your sleep schedule and your ability to be so cheerful right now. You were up early this morning to pass this end this brief federal government shutdown, pass this really big budget bill that funds the government through March 23rd. But it's also pretty notable because it's a huge spending increase under a conservative administration and conservative Congress. You voted for it. Why do you think that such a big spending increase was popular amongst Republicans?
Well, let's first put it in perspective. We are talking about the discretionary side of funding, which is only 30% of the government. The mandatory side is 70%, and we can't do anything about that. My son is an active duty Marine officer, and so that's my view that I look at, my lens that I look at through it. I know General Mattis. I've spoken with him. He has spoken to us many times about the degradation of our military and our military resources over the years. We've been in the longest, most protracted war in our nation's history, and the fact that 80 servicemen and women have died in training incidents instead of in combat recently is really a sign that we need to upgrade our military. I've traveled overseas 3 or 4 times last year and met with our military throughout Afghanistan, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, you name it. And we have issues with our military. My son has mentioned, some of the issues that we have with readiness. General Mattis urged us to vote for this. It was the most important part of the budget. But also, let's talk about another thing is for many, many years, we've been doubling and tripling our deficit and our debt in times when we didn't have any, we had very, very modest growth, never more than 1.8, 1.9%. We just put a major tax cut through that we're being told is going to see at least 4% growth coming up in the next quarter. So we're hoping to get growth off of that. Many people, including Senator Paul, voted for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which put a $1.5 trillion deficit in our budget right there. And so to me, funding the military is vitally important. I also come from one of the poorer districts in the nation where I have the largest migration of people in New York State. We have many social services needs still. Obamacare was not repealed, so we have double-digit increases in Obamacare. We have a lot of problems concerning the disproportionate share payment that goes to hospitals that were dependent on people signing up for health care that didn't. And so our hospitals, especially in my rural area, are struggling. Our health centers need assistance.
Sure, but Congresswoman, can I?
One of the worst in my district. And one other thing, last year was a very unusual year when it comes to disasters throughout the nation, whether it's throughout our shores, from Texas to Louisiana to Florida and Puerto Rico. We had fires in California, major flooding in my region, problems with FEMA. So we do have a number of issues we've got to take care of. We've got to look at, and one of the good things about the budget.
Congresswoman, yes, you know what, Congresswoman, if I can stop you, thank you so much for joining us, especially while you're at the airport. You are a trooper.
Yes.
We very much appreciate you joining us. But I wanted to ask you, because the chairman, so you're on the House Financial Services Committee, and your chairman, Jeb Hensarling, he called this bill a monumental mistake and a sad day. And the bill passed with 67 GOP House votes against and 73 Dems for, which means that this bill only passed because Democrats voted for it, and it was a bipartisan bill in that way. I guess my question is, you had mentioned the fact that 75% of the spending right now is not, it's all just tied up already. We only have about 25% that's discretionary spending, but shouldn't you be responsible with that 25%? And I agree we need to do entitlement reform, but that 25% ain't no chump change.
No, it is not. And here's the important thing, that Jeb Hensarling is actually retiring, and he's from the great state of Texas, which is one of the free states, one of the most dynamic economies, one of the growing state. I'm from the state with the largest decline in population, some of the highest poverty indexes, some of the highest opioid addiction rates. I mean, we have a huge problem in New York. And right now, I'd like to see us continue with the benefits that are coming from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It's interesting, New York, our governor is unraveling all about the tax cuts, but the Tax Foundation has shown that New York is actually going to be one of the biggest growth gainers from this particular bill if the governor doesn't interfere and try to exact revenge on our tax cuts. So right now, we're in a different position than Jeb Hensarling. I have a totally different district. Jeb Hensarling's from a district with very dynamic economy.
Sure, I understand, and he's also got the shale boom as well. So, Congresswoman, I wanted to, well, we got you. I wanted to ask you about a bill, changing topics. It's a bill or a proposal, a policy proposal from our partner, the Independent Women's Forum. They've put forth a proposal on paid leave for families due to childbirth. And wanted to get your take on that, if you'd seen that proposal. It would basically allow mothers and families to collect their Social Security benefits early. So allow them to dip into the system that they've paid into and get the benefits while they're younger, so that they don't have to wait. But they would, they would be dinged, but it's something that they could get the Social Security benefits early while they're young and they have a child. What do you think about that?
I've never seen the proposal. So what happens when their child goes off to school? Is this a temporary sort of
temporary.
Social Security issue?
Temporary.
Because here's my big problem with paid family leave as the owner of a small business. It's not so much the money that it costs to pay someone, it's the loss of the person that does the job, the key employee. So if somebody decides to take 8 or 12 weeks off, and you have a small workforce, who's going to take the place of that person? Especially if, for example, they're in the sales department. I know when I ran my family business, if 3 salespeople were out in a week, that could mean the end of my business. Those sales aren't coming in, the money's not being collected, and the bills aren't being paid, and we're losing sales. So I've got to find someone to come in and take the place of that person on a temporary basis. And then what happens after that? That person has to actually lose their job, or maybe they don't want to have the job or they want to be permanent. And so it's a problem for small businesses. Larger businesses can handle that type of burden. It's just like with many of the compliance issues that you deal with as a small business owner. So my greatest concern is the small business owner. The federal government's going to be picking up the cost on that Social Security disability. I'm not sure that's necessarily the only way to do it. There are insurance plans that you can buy. I have my own personal insurance plan in case I am disabled for some reason, or I choose, if not now, I'm past the window of opportunity, but if I'm in the position where I would be needing the leave for childbirth, which I did when I had my son. I went on disability because I had a plan, my own private plan. So I don't really know enough about the issue, but I think it's something that we should provide flexibility on. But I think the private sector can do a lot better job, and maybe we can, in some ways, depending on a sliding scale aspect of it, you could help with the public sectors, using the public sector dollars on Social Security. But remember, Social Security is an entitlement that we've got to reform.
Hearing you talk about it, it's just fascinating to me how complex these issues are. You're confronted with so many of these things every day as a congresswoman, and they're not as cut and dry as they may seem on a quick proposal. There's so many more little nuances to things, and I appreciate that you took the time to go through some of those on the spot with us. And I hope that next time you're here, you can be in the studio with me. I've never had the good fortune of being here in the studio at the same time you're in the studio. So we hope you'll come back. Thank you so much for being such a champ, and we don't want you to miss your flight. So thank you for joining us on Skype, Congresswoman Claudia Tenney from New York. Thanks a lot. one of the things I wanted to get to with her was this story about the Dow this week. And I'll admit, I'm going to sit here and probably not be the greatest representative for the progressive side, because it's not my strength and it is yours. But the Dow did some of this week, and some people argued that President Trump kind of shot himself in the foot by talking about the strength of the stock market only before it went down by a big percentage, one of the largest percentages in history, and then rallied and then fell again. So it's been a very volatile week in the stock market, and we're going to talk about that and the new budget bill a little bit more with Americans for Prosperity's Akash, Chougule, and James Dennin from, he's a money reporter from Mike. So thank you so much for being with us. Hope I didn't totally ruin
Chougule.
it.
All right, I've heard much worse.
Oh my God, how bad did I do?
So how are you saying?
That was close. Say it for us.
Chougule.
Okay, well, that is the worst phonetic spelling I've ever seen in my life.
No, I think it's actually it was actually a real.
It's just they spelled it Cho-Gully.
Gully.
Yeah, well,
That's
you
how
got to put an
say it.
emphasis on one of these things so I can know which ones.
You did a great job. It was right.
Yeah.
You just couldn't read it.
So what? Tell me, Akash. This whole Dow thing, how is that affecting Americans' prosperity? Since you grew from that,
I think we can't read too much into these sort of day-to-day changes, right? I mean, it's clearly a very shocking number. It makes for a lot of news headlines, but I think the underlying fundamental factors in our economy are headed in the right direction, right? Some of these adjustments are natural. They do take place once a year or so. And a lot of it was simply based, we were talking beforehand, a lot of it was just based on overconfident investors, right? So this was bound to happen at some point. And while it does cause a lot of headlines, I think we have to be careful how much we attribute to the president, whether the market is doing really well or doing really poorly. And keep in mind that the underlying economic factors continue to move in the right direction, which I believe is largely driven by policy changes.
So a lot of Democrats this week, I can say when my party, I think, doesn't do what it should be doing, lost their minds because the Dow dropped and the president's to blame for this. They said, well, if it happened during Obama, we would have said it was horrible. Trump did the same. But one of the arguments that Democrats make consistently, and that I tend to agree with, is that the stock market doesn't necessarily really reflect the incomes of the majority of Americans. That really reflects the upper echelons, those folks who own a lot of stock, and most Americans don't. How much does it affect? And are the Democrats who are saying this is a horrible thing for the American economy, are they able to make that argument when they're saying that the great stock market doesn't help us?
Of course. I think that's a really good question. The Democrats are obviously being a little bit political, and they are sort of taking advantage of the fact that Donald Trump has kind of made himself a little bit vulnerable, what with all of his claims about the stock market and taking credit for the soaring stock market. And no one person can really take credit for the stock market. Well over half of the money that the companies in the S&P 500, which is sort of a broad, spectrum of companies, is made overseas. So obviously nothing that the President of the United States is doing affects that. And so I think it's not unfair for Democrats to call the president out on that. If that is going to be his favorite talking point, he should also have to own when the stock market falls, like it did this past week. But I think also it's important to take the week's dip in a little bit of context. It's not quite right to call it the biggest stock market drop in history. Black Friday.
Well, from the number of points, it was.
Right.
But as a percentage of the change, it was not.
Right. It wasn't.
So it's important to think about it that way. But I think what's interesting, Clay, to your point on the difference between Wall Street
blames Obama
versus...
in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Go for it.
No, Clay, I was going to agree with you, honey.
What?
The difference between Wall Street versus Main Street. That what I found was very interesting. Some analysis was saying that the reason for the stock market drop was that actually workers were seeing increases in their pay, which meant that expenses were going to increase for the corporations because average people were going to see a bump in what they're taking home, which I think is prosperity for the American people versus, and I'm all for job creation. I love entrepreneurs, but I thought that was an interesting explanation for some of what was happening. And I have to point out, Pam Little pulled her comment in here. She said, good point. And that was going back to what the Congresswoman said about big business rules may not work for small ones. I think what has been interesting, like I said, is to see this drop because it is the big blue chip people who are going public. I think you're going to see, and there's been different analyses of American workers and sort of the lower and middle income people are seeing their wages go up. So I think this is good. I mean, as much as I love business, I don't know, Akash, am I spinning things too positively here?
I think that's correct. I mean, one of the things that we need to be looking out for as the economy gets a lot stronger is, rising interest rates, trying to combat inflation. And so these kind of adjustments will have this sort of immediate impact on the market when you make these kind of adjustments. It's obviously on the Federal Reserve and managing monetary policy to make sure that there isn't, too drastic of an impact like this that's actually harmful. But in the long run, these are sort of encouraging signs, right, that we're combating inflation, wages are rising, which is the reason for this kind of adjustment to take place. And I think you have to keep going back to the fundamental factors and the fundamental indicators in our economy are doing really well, which are job growth, people's wages are going up, unemployment's going down. We're pulling more people back into the workforce, which I know you both have talked about a lot, with just people who have been on the sidelines for too long, which is not just a policy problem, obviously, but I think there's a lot of encouraging signs there that we need to keep in mind.
So one of the reasons that I think a lot of people would, especially conservatives, would argue that business is feeling more positive is this tax plan that was passed the end of last year. Setting aside one's beliefs on the tax plan, this budget that was passed this morning is not necessarily conservative. It's $800 billion in increased spending. How's that going to affect the confidence of, as far as conservatives believe, how's that going to affect the confidence of business if it doesn't necessarily align with the arguments they made in December?
Yeah, not well. So I think you hit on something really important here. So the bill itself was really, really bad just for the sheer amount of money it spent. This is bigger than any two-year non-defense spending increase than President Obama ever asked for. So it's a really outrageous increase in spending. But I think the other thing you touched on is that as we pile on more and more debt, if this bill were to stay in place, if these figures stayed in place for 10 years, it's $2 trillion, $2 trillion with a T, onto the national debt. That's going to increase, how expensive it is to borrow money, which is obviously going to increase our net interest payments on the debt, which is going to further harm sort of the ability of people to borrow and spend. And these economic indicators are going to get in riskier and riskier condition.
Well, I want to bring James in because I want to put a tweet up just to what you're talking about, Akash, about the spending. So we got a tweet about Paul Ryan and some comments that he was making on the floor of the House. And can we get that tweet up? So it's basically President will read it. So Speaker Ryan says the military spending is not the reason there are growing deficits. It's entitlements. Also healthcare and inflation. We could get rid of the military and we would still have a deficit. Ryan says that entitlement reform is the way to deal with the debt crisis. So the Congresswoman we just had previously was talking about how only 25% of the budget is discretionary. What's going to be the strategy from the left to stop the Republicans from this entitlement reform? I mean, I love Paul Ryan, and I know he's been talking about entitlement reforms for decades now. So if he's able to actually do that, then yeah. I mean, if I had to choose between entitlement spending and problems that are completely out of control, public sector unions running amok in our pensions and public tax dollars versus defense spending, I'm going to take defense spending. So what's the strategy for the left in this scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I think the left is not, this is not the issue that they own. And so I think that is sort of why you don't necessarily see a huge number of policy solutions aimed at bringing down the debt coming from the left. Establishment Democrats, especially when they're facing pressure in their primaries, they're facing, pressure from someone farther to the left who wants spending to go up even more. So it's not, the strength for them. But I do think that they do have a very compelling argument to make about Republicans, which is it's very hard for them to be able to say our priorities always can accommodate more spending when it needs to, but Democrats can't.
Right, well, she used that word strategy. Is there one? I mean, is there really a Republican is there a Trump strategy? Is there a Republican strategy in Congress right now? Because it doesn't seem like, to me, they're really doing anything consistently. One bill completely contradicts the other. Is there?
I think there's a lot of overlap on certain issues and there's zero overlap on other issues. So I think there's obviously dispute on things like trade, immigration. There was alignment on taxes, regulation. Spending is one where there is no alignment, right? Some, the Freedom Caucus, conservative members, they know that we need to cut spending. The president has no interest in taking on entitlements. Too many Republicans who are afraid of not getting reelected don't want to take on these entitlements that people are depending on that are driving our debt and deficit. So the party is all over the place. And with this budget deal, they've demonstrated that getting spending under control just is not an immediate priority, which is extremely disappointing as a conservative.
Part of that is the belly of the beast. I mean, political science 101 is that every politician likes to bring benefits home to their constituents. They don't like to make their constituents pay for them. And so it's very hard to expect politicians to innovate their way to a solution to that very fundamental problem, especially in this climate where we've just thrown a ton of stimulus into the economy. The economy is very strong. We're in very strange territory now.
Well, I think the Dow will probably continue to do a little bit of this, so you two please come back and go on the roller coaster ride with us. Akash, say it for me.
Chougule.
Chougule, gosh.
You nailed it that time.
I did.
Chougule.
Akash, Chougule, and James Dennin. Thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate
Thanks,
it.
guys.
Thanks for having
I'll
me.
still stand by the fact that that was not very good phonetic spelling.
We can agree to disagree.
Let's move on to our Bookster segment. Those folks know how to spell.
Bookster, B-O-O-K-S-T-R. Check it out, bookster.com.
Sarah's not with us today, but we do have author and senior women's reporter for HuffPost, Emma Gray. I think I pronounced that one pretty well.
I think it's pretty
Her new
hard
book,
to botch that one up,
well,
Clay.
I'm good at botching things up. Her new book, A Girl's Guide to Joining the Resistance, addresses the concerns of activists everywhere and gives advice on how to stay involved. Thank you for joining us, Emma.
Thanks for having me.
Are you a
And
member
I
of the
love these
Resistance?
glasses.
I'd say I'm a reporter on the Resistance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it just as strong today as it was a year ago? Or is it starting to lose some of its momentum? What do you think?
I'd say it is incredibly strong. You know, I covered the Women's March, the first one, and then I was out in New York City covering the second one. And I admit that I thought there was going to be a little bit of falling off. I thought maybe we'll see some smaller crowds. There won't be a unified message. And I was shocked to see that actually people were out there in full force, interviewed at least a handful of people who had not marched the first time and had come out this time. And I think that the Time's Up and Me Too movement really energized especially women around these broad umbrella of the resistance. So,
Well, and full disclosure for our viewers, if you didn't know, last year, Bold worked with Emma to do an event. You all were watching, and Clay.
Yeah.
Well, actually, you weren't here either.
I saw it. You were in DC.
David Grosso was anchoring here, and we streamed live from the National Press Club.
We had a great time.
And the conference was happening there on Inauguration Day, and you mentioned it in your book. And by the way, can we put that book cover up, the digital version? I thought it was very interesting. If you look very closely at the book cover, you can see a girl's guide to being a lady behind there, which I thought was hilarious. And you don't have it on the print version, though.
Oh, it is. It's there.
It
It's there. It's just a little bit harder to see. It is there.
Tell me there is a little bit of a dichotomy. Well, that may not be the word, but Carrie's talked about it here. Some people see the resistance as, and I'm putting that word in quotes, the resistance as being a movement of the left against the current administration.
Mm-hmm.
Some people see the resistance as being women saying, time's up, me too, and it's time to start respecting women in ways that they haven't been respected. I would argue, and I can't put words in your mouth, but I think I know you will, I would argue that Carrie is a strong supporter of that second part, but maybe not of the first one. Is it possible to be a member of the resistance and not necessarily be against the current administration?
I think that it's kind of self-defined in a lot of ways. I think my book and the women that I spoke to for this book largely identify as progressives, not necessarily as Democrats, because I think a lot of the work that I speak about in the book also that, you know, these people would take issue with things that the Democratic establishment has done. I think the most important thing about the resistance is that it's really, a lot of it is just an awakening of work that was already going on before Donald Trump. I do think that the current administration set off a wave of activism in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. But a lot of these issues, you know, institutional racism, sexual harassment in the workplace, that doesn't know party lines.
Carrie, you've talked in the past about the difficulties of being someone who is conservative and feeling as if though you fit into this movement of women's rights.
Yeah. Well, and I think even the word feminist, that's such a complicated word for a lot of conservative women. So, yes, I consider myself a feminist because I do believe in equal rights for men and women. But I think that word has become such a hypercharged word for a lot of conservative women that it has come to mean that you have to believe in government intervention, to achieve equality versus let's just have social equality by the way that, women are given. I guess the difference is equal opportunity versus equal access.
Would you consider yourself a part of the resistance?
Equal outcomes versus equal opportunity.
Would you consider yourself a part of the resistance? The word resistance, as it's used here.
I mean, again, it's such a complicated thing because, yes, I want to resist any force that would keep a woman down. So, I think what happened again with Porter this week, I would describe him in his behavior as toxic masculinity. I absolutely would. But does that mean that toxic masculinity isn't present on the left? No. I mean, we saw that with Hillary Clinton and a staffer that she didn't fire and chose to keep on her staff, who was accused of sexual harassment, different things. I agree, wife beating is different from, but still it's similar. It's two sides of the same coin. So I agree with Emma that, sexism happens everywhere, regardless of your party affiliation. And so in that respect, I do resist anything to keep a woman down, but I am not going to agree that we need government intervention to solve all our problems.
So what's the girl's guide to being someone to being a part of a resistance and feeling empowered and wanting to get involved when you don't necessarily feel like you agree with all of those same arguments?
Well, I think that there's always things from this book that you can take away regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. There are a lot of lessons, things that I heard from activists, like the power of using your own story, telling your own story, not being afraid to take up space. I think often as women, we are socialized to make ourselves small, to step aside. And I really wanted my book to be a rallying cry that, no, you can speak up. You should own your narrative. And that narrative is incredibly, incredibly powerful. And I also talk a lot in the book about having, what the Women's March has termed daring discussions, reaching across to people that you might not agree with all the time and setting boundaries for a productive conversation, not necessarily going into it seeking to change that person's mind, but to reach a point of understanding. And I think that is something that is incredibly important for all of us to take away.
And so what have you seen? Because I know one thing we talked about last year was just a huge uptick in women who are thinking about running for office, not only at the federal level, but state and local as well. Well, what's transpired in the past year since we were talking about that?
It's so crazy because we were having that discussion, weeks after the election happened, and we do not see that momentum slowing. And I think it is somewhat across the aisle, more so on the left for sure, but women are stepping up. Organizations like She Should Run, like Emily's List, have seen record numbers of women saying, hey, I'm going to raise my hand and I want to run for office. And we even saw, in smaller elections, a woman who, ran against a man who had shamed the Women's March and then beat him. Like these little nuggets that I think are incredibly, incredibly empowering. And we also know that women, when they are in office, are more likely to be able to reach consensus across the aisle. So I think would be great for the country as a whole.
Why'd you look at me like that when you said that?
You can man at the table.
I am pretty damn good. I am pretty.
You are.
I am damn good at finding consensus at this table. Trust me.
You are.
Can a man though be a part of this resistance?
Absolutely.
I don't mean that in a trivial way. I mean, some of the guys, there have certainly been men in Hollywood, especially, who've spoken up as a part of this Me Too thing, but some have been kind of bashed for not doing it the right way. I mean, how afraid should I be of saying the wrong thing? Seriously.
I think it's difficult. I would say take the risk, step into the fray, and then if you mess up, take responsibility and say, oh, I didn't get this quite right, but I'm going to listen to that feedback and I'm going to keep going. And I think that it can be scary. It can be scary, but I also think that, we need men in these conversations. And I would hope that men would have the backbone to kind of just go for it and then take the feedback with, in stride.
Oh, gosh.
So, and Emma, what surprised you as you've written this book? What surprised you the most while you're writing it and then when it comes out?
Oh, gosh. So the chapter that I referenced before about owning your own story, that wasn't something that I thought I was going to include before I started interviewing people. And then so many women ended up mentioning that I wrote a whole chapter about it. And as the book was in final copy edits, Me Too had started. And I was like, oh gosh, I have to go back and add that into this chapter about storytelling. So there was something really incredible about seeing all of these activists say, this is powerful, and then seeing that played out right in front of me as I was in the process of writing the book.
This book, let's be honest, and we're going to have to go in a second, but it's not about the...
By the way, can I just say, maybe if you write something, Carrie's getting a boyfriend, then it will happen, like, in real time?
I'll do it for myself, too.
Okay, let's do it.
It's like The Secret. It's like putting out in the universe.
Manifest it for me, Emma.
This book, though, is not necessarily about specifically being a part of this resistance. It's also a guide to sort of being an activist.
Yes, absolutely. Being an activist. And I hope that, you know, the advice in this book will outlast this year. I don't want it to feel incredibly dated. I think it was set off by this moment, but I also...
You were doing it beforehand, too.
Yeah, and a lot of the women that I interviewed for this were doing this work long before, and will be doing it long after.
Well, Emma Gray. Okay, I said it right. Emma Gray, thank you very much for joining us. You please check it out on Bookster, A Girl's Guide to Joining the Resistance. Thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Emma.
Did I say the wrong thing while we were doing that?
No.
Was that pretty
You know
good?
what? You were an ally.
Oh, thanks. I try my best to be. She mentioned something kind of quickly there about, you know, people coming from different points of view and sort of trying to find consensus and trying to find a way to get along. Our next segment is both Valentine's Day themed and Carrie's second favorite topic in the world themed, which is Carrie finding a boyfriend. And how to do it in a world where she's in New York and she's a conservative and she's surrounded by people who believe differently than her.
This is just...
But we're excited. Come on now. You know it's one of your things. It's one of your things. It's okay. It's okay. As long as you're talking about that, you're not talking about mine. So,
no, that's what I was about to say, actually. This is not just about being a conservative. And in fact, I don't even really want to talk about politics in this segment. I just want to talk about love and what it's like to have a spouse who works in the same industry as you. Which, Clay, I know you've had some people that you've dated that
don't
maybe...
talk about it. And
I know, but we can talk about it
How
in
about
the
we talk about it with our
abstract?
guests? Deneen and Tom Borelli are here with us. Thank you guys very much
Great to be
for
with
joining
you both.
us.
Thank you.
You both have some insight on some of Carrie's some of Carrie's biggest concerns in her life. Is that right?
No, well, it's just, you know, these are two power media people, and it's a power couple. And so I'm
Deneen's
just
a Fox News contributor. And,
exactly.
And Tom's with the contributor with the Conservative Review, right?
Yeah, and CRTV as well. Right. So, yeah, we're all over the place, as a matter of fact. But it's a good thing, because it's all about for love of country, really.
Yeah. And for us, it's really power couple we're really not comfortable with.
Oh, we're
like to challenge the power. That's
I like that.
Fundamentally, if you see what we've done over the years, we're really activists. We've challenged not only Republican politicians, Democrat politicians, but also corporate CEOs at shareholder meetings. So we really do just challenge power.
Did having that same viewpoint help? I mean, is that what brought you together in a way?
You could say that, because I wasn't really someone that was involved in this kind of work, so to speak. So, you know, meeting Tom and what he was involved in at the time, we met in corporate America. So it was like a different dynamics for me, so to speak. So, you know, it's all good.
Well, and
relationship first, politics and advocacy second. This is both our second or third careers.
Yeah.
I'm a trained scientist. I have a PhD in biochemistry. The last thing I ever thought I would be doing was politics, media, and activism.
I made him keep his shirt pocket protector home.
Often
you don't need that. You don't need
scientist. Get out of the lab, Tom.
No, I like that. So, well, okay, I'm curious about this, because you guys met at work and you didn't date at work, but with all this going on with Me Too and people crossing the line, Tom, how did you navigate that? And Deneen, how did you respond? How did this work for you? Because so many guys aren't getting it, and they don't know how to read cues. So clearly, there was some.
I see that. We went through mutual friends, really, where we kind of hung out, and you know, one thing led to another.
She chased me down. She's not going to admit it.
Yeah, okay, I did. But it's really off the rails now. What we're seeing, I think some companies are even putting in policies where if you ask once and they refuse, that you're never supposed to ask a person out again. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that I was reading recently, which is just crazy. What about personal responsibility and just being adults?
But isn't that sort of, I mean, important? I mean, how do you know? And I think that's, we're talking about working in the same industry, and to some degree, not at the exact same place right now, but at times you have. How does that work? And is it responsible? how dangerous is it for either the man or the woman to be able to ask somebody out at work, to be able to do that if you're in the same place, because we're now facing this new movement of people being, I don't want to use the word hypersensitive because I think a lot of it is incredibly legitimate, but there is an increased focus on the way people address sorts of relationships within the workplace.
Well, generally, it's kind of risky having a relationship within the workplace, because if it doesn't work out, you have to see the person every day. But at the end of the day, you have to be an adult. You know, what's so wrong about that? You have to be able to treat people as people, and that's really just common sense and character. It really does matter. And I think now, to your point, it's gone way over the rails where people are afraid to maybe approach a coworker to ask them out. Or I've read instances where politicians don't want to interview or be alone with the women in their office because they're afraid they could be accused. So now there's police all over the place.
You laughed at that.
Well,
but that
was what Vice President Pence, that was his policy, and people mocked him. But now, in many ways, it seems like, I mean, he's being vindicated, I think. But I want to ask, though, about this question of competing versus collaboration, because you guys seem like you have a very great dynamic where you're lifting each other up. Because I once dated a guy who was also a journalist, and he accused me of being jealous of him. And he accused me of trying to basically almost sabotage him. And so I'm just curious.
Right.
Yes,
Okay.
not
Just
with
checking.
this person anymore. It was a long, long time ago. And I don't date journalists anymore anyway. Yeah. But so here's my question. Do you guys ever feel that way? Like you're competing? Like how does that work when you're, you know, basically doing the same thing?
Yeah, no, we help each other out. As a matter of fact, just going on TV, for example, like I will be on Fox News maybe early in the morning. We'll drive down to the city. I'm going over whatever the talking points are that I need to, you know, wrap my head around and read up on the articles. Sometimes they change the story before I get there or while I'm on set, so you never know what the environment will be. But it's a team effort. Tom drives, I'm doing research, then he'll get a call maybe. He's got to go on. Yeah, so it's, you know, it's like chaos every day.
We're very different, right? Can you tell? So it's almost like we play different sports. And once someone asks me, say, gee, Tom, you have all these degrees. Aren't you jealous of your wife getting a lot of limelight? I go, no. Would I be jealous of my son who hits a home run in a Little League? I mean, you go for the team win. You go for the hot player. You go for the purpose. And we play multiple roles. I first started out in TV and she was watching. And then a role's reversed.
But that's
what I mean. But
that's maturity too, and I don't think the guy you dated was very mature, Carrie.
But it also comes down to
You're right, Clay.
But it also comes down to personality too. I mean, it's really nice not to be in a competitive landscape at home. I mean, my God, that's the last thing we would want.
Do you talk about work at home?
All the time.
Oh yeah, we work from home, and you know, we travel the country as well. We speak at different events. A lot of times we're on the platform together, which is great.
And I'm the warm-up band.
He's the warm-up band.
That's the way I introduce myself, as the warm-up band.
You do anything special for Valentine's Day? She reminded me this morning that it's this week. She wore her red.
What, Valentine? What?
You better.
Oh, okay. So there may be secrets.
Reminder.
There may be secrets that are.
Yeah, I want to ask one more question too about the dynamic interracial marriage, because my sister-in-law is black, my brother is white. Sometimes they get comments, but at the end of the day, they love each other, and their kids are adorable. They're like the next Halle Berrys. They're my two little nieces. Like, what's that been like for you guys?
I get criticism perhaps on social media, but face to face.
No, rarely.
Nothing.
Much easier to say something on social media when you ain't got
hiding behind a computer. Right? Exactly.
Once we were walking in New Orleans and an elderly black gentleman said, "Damn shame," as we walked by. But
that was a compliment.
That's right.
That was a
jealous.
compliment.
He's jealous
of you.
Jealous.
That's what it was.
It doesn't matter. You know, again, we're fundamentally libertarian in terms of let people do what they really want to do and get the government out of the way.
Well, we'll share some. We'll share and compare some social media comments one day. And I bet you I can make you feel a lot better about yourself.
A whole hour.
Tom and Deneen Borelli, thank you very much for joining us. Happy Valentine's Day. Now the pressure's on to do something. Are you doing anything for Valentine's Day?
Well, yes, I am actually.
Oh, what are you doing?
Clay.
Oh, Lord.
Hey, would you be my Valentine?
Well, I think you know what? I probably will disappoint you in some ways, but yes, Carrie, thank you very much. We got a little special video that one of our Bold staff folks made for us. Let's take a
Jeremy. It's from Jeremy on Team Bold.
That is absolutely adorable. Jeremy,
talented. Good
mad
job, Jeremy.
props to Jeremy for that. Thank you very much. And thank you guys for joining us. Have a wonderful, wonderful Valentine's Day. Enjoy the Olympics opening ceremonies tonight. And we'll be here at 9 on Tuesday.
Well, and in 1 hour, come back at 12 Eastern for Bold Life with Kirsten Hagland. And yes.
9 on Tuesdays with Bold Business and David Grasso. And we'll be back here on Friday at 10. See you then.
Bye.